So within about 10 minutes of my initial best of every Smite ability video going up, I already had tons of requests to cover the same thing but reversed. So here we are taking a look at the worst abilities in Smite and just for fun, putting all those terrible abilities onto one god and seeing just how bad they would be. So as with the last video, we need to lay down a few ground rules on how I'm judging these abilities since some people will judge them differently than others. For me, I'm judging the ability in a vacuum without any synergy from the other abilities of the god's kit. So for example, Agni's 1, Noxious Fumes, is normally pretty powerful because it can stun on demand, but without the rest of Agni's abilities it becomes trash and so might be in consideration for this list. This also includes any resource bars, passive meters and the like that the god might have. So our Plashes 2, which is normally a pretty good ability, will have no corpses to work off and thus will be pretty terrible, or perfect for this video depending on how you look at it. And as with last time, the ability has to be able to actually function to be legal. So as I mentioned, Agni's 1 is fine because it still works without igniting it, but Rama's 1 is banned because the ability is literally unusable without astral arrows, which are a part of his passive. And finally, stand switcher abilities are considered individually as before. So if you wanted to choose Arteo's 1 as the worst ability, for example, you have to choose one of the abilities, not both. And with actual stand switching abilities like Arteo's ultimate, they're disqualified entirely. Otherwise, we just have a character made up entirely of terrible stand switching moves and nothing else, which will be boring. So to recap, the ability must actually function outside of the god's kit. No other factors or resources from within the home kit of the ability. Stand switcher abilities are evaluated on their own, not as a pair, and actual stand switching abilities themselves are banned. Alright, so with the rules in place, let's dive into this with some god-awful Smite passives. Now of course, finding the worst ability in a set of abilities that are designed to be useful and good is difficult, so don't take this video too seriously. If I picked an ability from your main god, I'm not trying to say they're trash and you shouldn't play them, this is just for fun. So passives in Smite tend to have a wide variance. Some are utterly broken, as you will have seen if you watch my best of Smite abilities video, and some can be downright awful. So my considerations for the objectively worst passives in Smite are Hu Yi, Merlin, Arachne, and Nox. So Hu Yi is pretty obvious. When you get a crit, you can't be crit again for 3 seconds. Even if 100% crit chance was the meta build for every ADC, this still wouldn't be a good passive, that's how bad it is. In any situation other than that, such as 50% crit builds or no crit at all, and this passive is almost useless. Seriously, all that has to happen in your game is the enemy ADC goes a Kins build instead of crit, and your passive is effectively worthless. At least Geb's passive is an effective way to deal with crits that's consistent. Merlin's passive is just a terrible version of Polynomicon, an item that already doesn't see too much play outside of a few specific mages. Arachne passive only becomes even somewhat useful when targets are low HP, and even then it's pretty mediocre and pretty much always worse than Daji's passive. And Nox's passive is decent in theory, giving a potential 12% power boost, but in practice the candles are way too easy to lose and you'll probably lose all 4 of them before you even get any damage off in a fight. It's just too inconsistent to be considered useful. So while Merlin, Arachne and Nox are pretty bad passives all things considered, they are at least a bit useful or decent situationally. Hu Yi's passive is the only one here that is frequently entirely useless, and even when it should be good, it's just not. Definitely the worst passive in Smite we could choose from in my opinion. So with Hu Yi's passive selected, let's move on to the first ability slot. This slot comes with a lot of abilities that are reliant on other abilities to be good, so plenty of juicy entries for this video that will be terrible when taken out of their home kit. For first abilities, I have Agni, Terra, Bacchus, and Chernobog. Agni's 1 entirely relies on his kit to do the work it does. Take Agni's 1 and put it on any god but him, and it's literally not worth the 80 mana you're paying for it. Terra's 1 also relies on her kit, often being used in combination with her 3 to get the powerful AoE route and reset it for the second dash. Without her monolith or walls, you never get to double cast this ability, and it's just a short range, slow dash that does mediocre damage. Bacchus's 1 is used to charge up his passive, which is definitely very strong in his home kit, but take that out of his home kit and all it does is give 15 up to 35 protections. And finally, Chernobog's 1 is heavily reliant on his 2 to detonate it quickly, and while it's not useless on its own, it's definitely a lot weaker, especially against gods. It would still be a decent wave clear tool, however. So this one is really no competition. While some of these other choices like Terra's singular dash or Bacchus's protections are bad, Agni's 1 is near useless. Its only real applicable use outside of Agni's kit is for objective damage or a tiny bit of wave clear. Its use against gods is almost completely gone, and it's not even worth the mana cost to use this in a teamfight. So with Hu Yi's passive and Agni's Noxious Fumes, let's move on to the second slot ability. So second slot in Smite is often the slot for heavy synergy abilities, and since we're judging these abilities objectively on their own, these types of moves can be some of the worst overall. We have Nuar, Apuash, Kuzumbo, and Set for this category. Nua's minions, while not completely useless on their own, do have their utility and damage severely nerfed when you take away her ability to explode them from the 3. They just become glorified body blockers at that point and do a very small amount of damage and reduce enemy protections a little bit. Apuash's 2, once again, is very good in his home kit, but when you take away the whole corpses thing, yeah, this ability becomes pretty terrible on its own. Without corpses, this ability does 100 base and 10% scaling and damage, which is just pitiful, and probably not even worth the mana. You may as well basic attack at that point. Its only real use will be applying on-hit effects like Soul Reaver or Ethereal Staff on a fairly low cooldown. Kuzumbo's 2 is already pretty bad even in his home kit, but when you take away the cooldown reduction on his Kappa and Sumo Slam, which are specified in the ability, this ability is quite literally just Thorn's Relic but way worse. And finally, Set's 2 is perhaps the single worst ability in the entire game when judged in a vacuum with no other abilities. Seriously, this ability is worse than Agni's 1 when it's used on its own. All this ability does is spawn a clone that can attack people that go near it. The range they attack in is pretty small and very avoidable, so honestly, this ability just straight up does nothing outside of Set's kit, and once again, you wouldn't even cast the ability due to its mana cost. So Set's 2 is obviously the pick for our second slot ability. I just explained everything you need to know here. This ability is essentially useless outside of Set's kit, beside giving some area vision and a tiny bit of wave clear, I guess. A close runner-up if this ability didn't exist, however, would definitely be Corpse Explosion due to its pitiful damage. So we currently have Huyi's passive, Agni's Noxious Fumes, and Set's Spawn Clone. Let's get ourselves the worst third ability in the game, shall we? So this third slot is actually one of the least terrible abilities of the basic 3 slots. There aren't any truly useless abilities here, but there are definitely a few that are outright terrible. So for this slot, I have Neith, Amuzangab, Thoth, Set, Janus, and Persephone. So Neith's backflip, while decent against players who don't know how to punish it, is honestly one of the worst escape abilities in the game. If this video was judging the abilities in their respective god kits, this ability would still be here. It's way too slow and way too easy to counter, and honestly fails at doing the job of an escape ability. Plus, outside of Neith's kit, the weave this ability spawns is useless, so you can't even do things like backflip into exploding the weave with the 1. Amuzangab's Honey without his Hives or Swarm ability is literally just a 20% slow. This ability's damage relies entirely on AMC's Bees mechanic and will be terrible without them. Thoth 3 would still function for basic attacks, but the main reason it's strong on Thoth is because of the extra range and damage he gets on his 1, 2, and ultimate. Without that, it's just a glorified basic attack damage buffer that doesn't do much else besides taking towers or objectives slightly faster. So Set has the honour, shared with someone else that we'll find out later, of being one of only 2 gods to be considered twice for this list. This isn't a knock on Set, it's just that his abilities are very synergistic and this video format doesn't cater well to that kind of play. So Set's 3 without his spawn clones is just a small area with a mediocre blind effect and negligible damage. The teleport aspect of the ability wouldn't function outside of Set's kit, and while this ability does have a nice 15% damage reduction to physical gods, it's not enough to exempt itself from this list. Janus 3 is pretty meh, all things considered. The movement speed aspect is minimised because you don't have portals to work with. The additional damage scaling is specifically for Janus' abilities and his abilities only. It wouldn't work for other gods or abilities. So really, this is just a line that slows people, and while the slow is stronger than the likes of AMC's Honey, that doesn't make it good. And finally, we have Persephone's 3, which without her whole plant mechanic is literally just a short range leap that does nothing else. Once again, like I said for this category at the start, not completely useless, but definitely not good. So this one was a closer call than the other ones simply because none of these abilities are useless. AMC's Honey, Persephone's Flourish, and Thoth's 3 are definitely top contenders, but I think I have to go with Thoth's Glyphs ultimately. All they would do is give allies a tiny damage boost on their basic attacks, notably only for ranged basic attacks as well, so only like half the cast could even use this. And with the way Smite teamfights go, a stationary glyph isn't going to be of too much use. The only real use for this is taking towers and objectives slightly faster. And finally we have the ultimate. So I'm going to preface this by saying none of these ults are useless or even bad necessarily. Ultimates are designed to be the best a god has to offer, and choosing the worst of the best is hard, so if your main's ultimate is on here, don't be too salty, this is just for fun after all. So for the ultimate, I considered Hades, Sol, Arachne, Ymir, and Horus. Hades' ult is way too easy to counter, and on any god that would have trouble getting into a fight, it would be extremely hard to use. As we've seen in the past, even on a tanky Guardian, this ability wouldn't see too much use. It's not usually terrible, but it's pretty bad in most situations. Soul ult is extremely hard to land on gods, and usually you're going to get 2 or 3 hits of this unless you're an absolute god at the game or are hitting a stationary target. This is best used for taking objectives, since of course they're usually stationary, but for fighting actual gods it's not the best. I suspect it was designed this way as a balancing mechanism because the rest of Soul's kit is really strong, as you will have seen if you watch the best of every Smite ability video. So the Spooder is the second god to have 2 of her abilities considered for this video. Arachne Ultimate is pretty terrible. It's bad as an engage tool due to it being extremely telegraphed, and it's a decent runaway tool, but if the best thing you're getting out of your ultimate ability is a quick way to run away from a fight, then you can probably find better choices. Ymir ult is so close to being good, and it pains me to put it here, but it's just way too hard to confirm. In fact, a lot of these entries fall into this category of potentially amazing, but in practice, not so much. This does some of the highest damage in the game in a huge AoE, but the extreme wind-up allows most gods to easily escape it, and without Ymir's freeze, tankiness or ice wall, it becomes even less reliable. And finally we have Horus ult, which is just very strange to use in general. On a non-tanky god this ability will be awful, but you can say that about a lot of supportive ultimates. But even on Horus it's not the best, and much like Neith's 3 from earlier, I think even in the context of Horus's kit, this ability is still a bottom 5 ultimate in the game in my opinion. It strictly has just one use, and that's getting people into a fight, but often you don't even want your carries to be right up in the thick of things, and the small damage shield this ability gives isn't enough to make up for its lack of versatility and overall usefulness. So much like the third slot, none of these abilities are useless and it's hard to choose between this bunch. But ultimately, pun intended, I think Arachne's ultimate is the least useful in the most situations, so I'm going to give it to Nightcrawler. So that's our list of terrible abilities. So just what kind of abomination will we have created here if we put all these terrible abilities into one kit? We'd have Hu Yi's Sun Touched as our passive, preventing crits for 3 seconds after we take a crit. Agni's Noxious Fumes as our first ability, doing a small amount of AoE damage and nothing else. Set's Spawn Clone as our second ability, being able to spawn a clone that auto-attacks nearby enemies and does nothing else. Thoth's Glyph as our 3, which adds a small amount of damage to ranged basic attacks that fire through it, and Arachne's Nightcrawler ultimate that allows us to escape or potentially engage and do some decent damage. I think I can safely say we've created the worst Smite god to ever exist or ever even be thought of. Release Raven and Cabrakan put together ain't got nothing on this amalgamation of despair. I doubt you could win a game with this god without being absolutely carried by your team. But anyway, if you enjoyed this theoretical nonsense, then be sure to drop a like before you leave and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like this in the future. I'll catch you guys later. Have a great day, stay safe, and peace out, you nerds.